My name is Grace. 40 years ago, if you had asked anyone in the village of Kadari who owned the most gold between the two rivers, they would have pointed straight at me without even pausing to think. Today, I live in 2 small rooms on the 3rd floor of a building in the city, and I share a bathroom with 3 other families. But before I tell you about the throne or the husband I buried, or the gold that once sat under my own floor, let me tell you about the morning I stood outside my own front gate, holding out my hand for a plate of cold rice. The boy guarding that gate was maybe 17. He had no way of knowing that I had built that compound with my own dowry, brick by brick, before his mother was even born. "Old woman," he said, not unkindly, "wait by the wall. If there is food left over, you will get some." And I said, "Thank you." I, who once had 11 servants of my own, thanked a boy for the chance of leftover rice. I'm telling you this first, so that you understand something. This is not a story about gold. It is a story about what gold does to a heart that refuses to open its hand. Stay with me, because the woman standing by that wall is not who you think she is, and the reasons she ended up there are not what you expect. If stories like this one, stories about pride, betrayal, and the true price of a closed fist, are the kind that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing so the next one finds you. Now let me take you back to where it all began, to a barefoot girl who owned nothing in this world but a wrapper, a strong back, and a stubborn kind of hope. I was born in a small mud house at the edge of Kadari, the last of 5 children, to a farmer named James and a woman named Elizabeth, who sold peppers and dried fish at the market on Fridays. We were not poor in the way that starves a person, but we were poor in the way that teaches a child never to waste anything. Not water, not oil, not kindness, because you never knew when you would need it returned to you. I grew up strong. By 12, I could carry a basin of cassava on my head for 2 miles, without spilling a drop. By 16, the older women in the village had already started saying, in that teasing way old women have, that whoever married me would never go hungry, because my hands did not know how to sit still. I did not think much about marriage in those days. I thought about the yam harvest, and about my mother's cough that never fully left her, and about the school books I was never given the chance to open past a certain age, because there was no money for it, and someone had to help on the farm. It was at the Kadari Harvest Festival, the year I turned 18, that I first saw Prince Edward, the only surviving son of King Henry. He did not arrive the way I expected a prince to arrive. He came on foot, dressed simply, walking among the stalls and greeting elders by name, tasting groundnut soup from 3 different women, just so none of them would feel slighted. I remember thinking, with the sharp honesty of a girl who has nothing to lose, that a man who bothered to remember an old woman's name was a rare kind of man. He noticed me because of an argument, of all things. A trader was trying to shortchange an old blind man on the price of kola nuts, and I had planted myself in front of the trader's table and refused to move until he corrected the price. Edward watched the whole exchange from a distance, and later that evening, he found a way to be introduced to me by my uncle, who nearly fainted at the honor of it. "You made an enemy of a kola nut trader today," Edward said to me, half smiling, "for a man you are not even related to." He was going to lose that year's harvest to a cheat, I told him. Somebody had to say something. And if it had been me cheating him, then I would have said something to you too, my prince, and worried about the consequences afterward. He laughed at that, a real laugh, not the polite laugh men give when they are only being courteous. He came back to my father's compound 3 more times that season, each time with a small gift. Not gold, not jewelry, but practical things, a new hoe blade, a sack of seed yams, medicine for my mother's cough. King Henry was not pleased, I would later learn. He had hoped his son would marry into a family of standing, a family that could strengthen his alliances, not a farmer's daughter with rough hands and no dowry to speak of. But Edward was patient and firm in the way that quiet men often are, and eventually his father relented, on one condition, that I prove myself worthy of the household through a year of service to the palace, before the marriage was formalized. I agreed without hesitation. I had never been afraid of work. That year taught me the rhythms of palace life, the ceremonies, the languages of respect, the delicate art of knowing when to speak and when silence served better. I did not change who I was, and I think that is precisely why the household came to accept me. The elder women who had expected a proud farm girl to demand special treatment found instead a young woman who still swept her own floor and still remembered the names of the market women who had once cheated her uncle. We married in the dry season, under a sky so clear that the elders called it a blessing from the ancestors themselves. I wore beads instead of gold that day, because gold, at that point, was still a stranger to me. It did not stay a stranger for long. Within 3 years, surveyors working Edward's inherited land near the eastern hills confirmed what old stories in the family had only ever whispered about. A rich seam of gold running beneath what had been considered unremarkable farmland. Alongside it, the cocoa Edward's father had planted decades earlier came into full, extraordinary yield, feeding buyers from 3 regions away. Money, real money, began arriving in a way I had never imagined possible. Within a decade, the household I had married into was, without exaggeration, the wealthiest in the entire region between the 2 rivers. I will not pretend that I disliked it. I loved the silk that replaced my old wrappers. I loved that my mother's cough was finally treated by a doctor brought in from the city, and that she lived 11 more healthy years because of it. In those early years of plenty, I was, if I am honest with myself now, a genuinely generous woman. I funded the repair of the village well myself, the same well the whole of Kadari still drank from. I paid the school fees for 11 children whose families could not afford them, Margaret's youngest daughter among them, because Margaret had been my closest friend since we were girls hauling water together. Villagers called me Queen Grace, the one with the open hand, and I wore that title with more pride than I ever wore my gold. I gave birth to our son, Michael, in the 7th year of our marriage, and King Henry, who had once resisted our union so fiercely, held his grandson and wept openly, telling anyone who would listen that he had been wrong about me, and that the ancestors had clearly sent him the daughter he never had. I remember that moment with more warmth than almost any other in my life. I did not yet know how completely it would all unravel, or how much of the unraveling would be my own doing. King Henry died peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, and Edward became King of Kadari in his place. I became in title and in truth the most powerful woman in the region, Queen Grace, keeper of the royal treasury. Then, in the 11th year of our marriage, a fever swept through the eastern hills during the rainy season. Edward, ever stubborn about visiting the sick himself, rather than sending others in his place, caught it while comforting a dying elder. He was gone within 9 days. Michael was only 9 years old, far too young to rule, which meant that by custom, I stood alone as regent over everything. The gold, the land, the cocoa income, the treasury that had grown larger than even Edward's father could have imagined. Grief does strange things to different people. Some it softens. It hardened me. I told myself in the beginning that I was only being careful, that a widow with a young heir and no husband to protect her had to guard what belonged to her son with both hands, trust no one, and take no risks. Looking back now, from these 2 small rooms, I understand that I was not being careful at all. I was being afraid, and I let that fear disguise itself as wisdom for years, because fear dressed in wisdom's clothing is very difficult to recognize, especially when you are the one wearing it. I began keeping the treasury ledgers myself, refusing even trusted elders access to the full accounts. I had a portion of the gold buried beneath the floor of the inner compound, telling myself it was insurance against thieves, though if I am honest, it was really insurance against everyone, including people who had never given me a single reason to doubt them. Edward's younger brother, Thomas, came to me 2 years after the funeral, asking for support to expand his own farmland so he could better provide for his growing family. A reasonable request, and one Edward himself would certainly have granted without a second thought. I refused him. The treasury belongs to Michael's inheritance, I told him, not to be scattered across every relative with an open hand. Thomas left that meeting quietly, but something in his face changed that day, something that never fully returned. Then Margaret's house burned down in a cooking accident the following dry season, and she came to me, the friend I had grown up hauling water with, the friend whose daughter's school fees I had once paid without a second thought. "Grace," she said, holding her youngest against her hip, "we have nowhere to sleep tonight." I gave her a small sum, far less than I could easily have afforded, and I told her, gently but firmly, that I could not keep giving away what belonged to my son's future. She thanked me, because that is the kind of woman Margaret was, but I saw something close to disbelief behind her eyes. and I chose in that moment not to look at it too closely.
I stopped renewing the village school's funding the following year,
Telling the elders that the treasury needed to be protected during uncertain times, though the times were, in truth, no more uncertain than they had ever been. The well I had once repaired myself began to crack, and when villagers asked for help fixing it, I told them the royal treasury was not a charity. I did not see, or did not let myself see, that I was becoming exactly the kind of ruler my own younger self would have stood in front of a market stall to argue against. Resentment, I have come to learn, is patient. It does not arrive loudly. It gathers in corners, in quiet conversations by the well that no longer worked properly, in the memory of a woman who used to be called the one with the open hand, and was now called, behind cupped palms, the one who buries gold under her own floor while children walk to a school with a leaking roof. Robert had served as my steward and chief accountant for nearly 6 years by then. A clever, careful man I trusted with the treasury's daily workings. What I did not know, or did not care to notice, was that Robert had grown quietly bitter over what he considered years of being underpaid relative to the fortune he managed, while I tightened every string around every purse, including his own wages. Thomas, still wounded from my refusal to help him, found in Robert a willing partner. Together, over many months, they built a case against me. Robert, who controlled the ledgers, began quietly altering records to suggest that portions of the buried gold that by long-standing custom was meant to belong partly to the village council upon a king's death, not solely to his widow, had been deliberately hidden by me from the community's rightful share. It was, in truth, only a half-lie built cleverly around a real and uncomfortable fact. I had buried gold, I had hoarded it, I had refused to share what tradition said should have been shared. The lie only needed to stretch that truth a little further to become devastating. Elder Solomon, who led the village council, and who himself had asked me for support rebuilding the collapsed bridge on the Eastern Road, only to be turned away 2 years earlier, did not need much convincing. When Robert presented the altered accounts before the full council, accusing me of concealing the village's rightful inheritance for my own private wealth, the room that had once bowed to me now sat in cold, deliberate silence. I stood before that council and told them the truth, that yes, I had buried gold, that yes, I had been guarding it fiercely, but that it belonged to my son's future, not to theft. Nobody in that room, I realized with a slow and sickening clarity, was inclined to believe the best about me anymore. I had spent nearly a decade teaching them not to. Every closed door, every refused request, every year the school went unfunded and the well stayed cracked, had been quietly building the very verdict now being read aloud against me. The council stripped me of my title as Queen Regent. They seized the buried gold in trust for the village, along with a significant portion of the family's remaining land, leaving only a modest allowance for Michael, still a minor, under the council's own supervision rather than mine. I was, in the space of one long, humiliating afternoon, no longer Queen Grace of Kadari. I was simply Grace, a widow with nowhere left to stand. I left the palace compound that had been my home for over 20 years, with Michael's hand in mine, and very little else. Some clothing, a small amount of money the council allowed me to keep, and a pride that took far longer to lose than the gold had. I went first to Margaret's door, in a shame so heavy I could barely lift my eyes to knock. I had refused her when her house burned. I fully expected her to close that door in my face, and I would not have blamed her for it. She did not close it. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she pulled me inside without a single word of reproach, though her own home was still smaller and more modest than it had been before the fire I had refused to fully help her rebuild. "You cannot stay long," she told me quietly that night. "I have very little myself, Grace. You know that better than anyone." It was the gentlest, most devastating sentence anyone had ever said to me, because it was entirely fair, and because I had made it that way. Other doors were far less gentle. Villagers I had once fed, whose children I had once schooled, now found reasons to be busy, reasons to look away, reasons their own households could not spare a single yam for the woman who had once counted her wealth in the hundreds of sacks. I understood, with the bitter clarity that only comes after it is far too late to matter, that I was simply being handed back exactly what I had spent a decade handing out. Michael and I made our way to the city with almost nothing. I took work wherever it appeared, washing clothes for wealthier families, selling roasted corn at roadside stalls, sweeping the floors of a market I once could have bought outright. Michael, robbed of the education and inheritance that should have been his, grew up faster and harder than any child of a king should have to. There were nights we went to bed on empty stomachs. Nights I lay awake, turning over every refusal I had once made so easily, understanding now, from the other side of the wall, exactly how each one had felt to the person standing outside it. It was years later, after Michael was grown and the city had become more truly home than the village ever would again, that I returned to Kadari one final time, drawn by a foolish, stubborn hope of seeing the old compound again. It had been sold by then to a wealthy businessman from another region, entirely unconnected to our family's history. That is the gate I told you about at the beginning of this story. The one where a 17-year-old boy, born long after any of this happened, told an old woman to wait quietly by the wall for whatever food remained. I stood there that afternoon and understood, fully and finally, everything I had built and everything I had buried, and everything both had ultimately cost me. Michael found steady work eventually, repairing cars in a small city garage, and he married a kind, steady woman named Ruth, who never once made me feel like a burden in their home, even in the difficult early years when there was barely enough space for the three of us, let alone four. Their children, my grandchildren, Daniel and Victoria, grew up here in these two small rooms with me. And it was Daniel, only last month, flipping through an old photograph, who asked me why I never wore gold like the grandmother in the picture did. I am telling you all of this tonight, children, because you asked me a simple question and deserved an honest answer, not a comfortable one. I was once the richest woman between two rivers, and I ended my story here, in two rented rooms, because I mistook gold buried in the ground for gold planted in people. And only one of those two things ever grows back after you take from it. The wealth you hoard for yourself alone will always eventually find a way to bury you back. But the wealth you plant freely in other people, a school fee paid, a well repaired, a door open to someone in need, that is the only kind of wealth that keeps growing, long after your own hands are too tired to hold anything at all. I do not have much to give you now, Daniel, Victoria. I have this small room and a pension that barely stretches to the middle of each month. But last week, when our neighbor's youngest fell ill and her mother had no money left for medicine, I gave her the last of what I had saved, without hesitation, without a ledger, without fear. It was the smallest gift I have given in this life, and it was the first one in a very long time that made me feel rich again. If this story reminded you of someone you know, or perhaps of a version of yourself you are trying not to become, I hope you will carry it with you. Thank you truly for sitting with an old woman's story tonight, for staying long enough to hear not just how I fell, but why, and what I found waiting for me on the other side of it. If you enjoyed this journey, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I will see you in the next story.